No matter what kind of cars you're into, the arrival of a new Porsche is always a big deal. Now, admittedly, when they look like this, not exactly the first Porsche that comes to mind, but still very important. But that brings us to the big question. Is it still as important of an introduction when it doesn't have one of these? And this is the Macan Electric. But something important to note here, they've added 4 inches of additional wheelbase storage space between the wheels of the vehicle. So now, why is all of this important? If you think about the purpose of a Porsche Macan, it's designed to be a vehicle, yes, practical, but a fun to drive vehicle. So keeping the overall length similar, but then giving more packaging space makes it a more practical vehicle, but more a Porsche at the same time. So in the cheap seats in the Macan 4, that has an output of up to 402 horsepower. Notice I say up to, that's with launch control, and up to 479 pounds of torque. Then there's the Macan Turbo, still all-wheel drive. That's something closer to the Taycans that we've gotten to know, up to 630 horsepower and a crazy torque at up to 833 pounds of torque. Now that brings us to a very obvious question. The Porsche Taycan, that has a 2-speed transmission, something very rare with electric vehicles. Well, this system does away with a 2-speed transmission and goes back to a single-speed transmission. Then we get into the obvious business of charging the vehicle. There's the battery storage. It's a 100 kilowatt hour battery, usable 96 kilowatt hours. Yes, it's 800 volt architecture like the Taycan and can charge up to 240 kilowatts. On board, so basically at home, you're talking 11 kilowatts. But something important to note, you guys have seen over the past year, many car manufacturers have moved support in the US from the current charging setup to the NAC setup, basically what Tesla is using. This is not going to come to market right away with a Tesla charger. Now, this being very early stages, the manufacturer hasn't quoted us charging times, so we'll have to put a pin in that, come back to that discussion when we drive the vehicle. Then it's a Porsche, so we have to talk about performance figures. Right now, they've given us 0 to 60 on the turbo, 3.1 seconds. Now, something important to note, 3.1 seconds for an electric vehicle, it would be safe to assume this is heavy. You would be correct. This is over 1,000 pounds heavier in its lightest form from the lightest current Macan internal combustion engine. So the fact that it's 3.1 seconds to 60, that's quite an achievement when you're adding that much weight. Up front, they've got double wishbones. In the rear, they've got a multi-link unit. They've placed the electric motor behind the rear axle. And you would think this is the wrong place to put any motor, whether it's internal combustion engine or gas, because it's very much like 911s. Well, what they've done is they've made the size of the motor a specific size. It's bigger in the turbo in the rear, but what they're doing is they're allowing for space for a 4-wheel steering system. This is not quite to the level of a Mercedes-Benz S-Class where it's 10 degrees of rear-wheel steering. Instead, it's up to 5 degrees of rear-wheel steering, and for the avoidance of doubt, the rear-wheel steering is optional on both vehicles. Now, something you and I have discussed over the years, different systems depending on the car. Like they've had a 3-chamber air ride and they've had a 2-chamber air ride. This continues with the 2-chamber air ride, again fitted as standard. Then we get into wheel sizes. This is fascinating because there are 3 different wheel sizes on a very small SUV. What you're looking at here are 21-inch wheels. Notice it's a staggered size. Not so much the wheel size, but the tire size. And it goes from 20 inches that are fitted as standard on the 4 up to 22 inches, which can be optionally fitted to the turbo. Now, this is where we get to a very important point. Is this the same platform as the current Taycan? Answer, no. What they've done is come up with a completely new platform that's going to underpin this, and as you can imagine, underpin other quote-unquote luxury vehicles within the Volkswagen group. So you could think there's going to be an Audi based on this platform. It's entirely possible you can see this underpinning a future fully electric Cayenne by extending out the wheelbase and length of the vehicle. Okay, so let's you and I come back to the world of reality, which means we have to discuss money. Now there's two different numbers we got to focus on because there's two different cars. Porsche has shared the general idea of what the base prices will be, no option prices yet. That Macan Electric, the 4, the all-wheel drive, is going to have a base price around $80,000 US here in North America. And then you look at the turbo, the one with a crazy amount of output, that's going to be $105,000 US. Now, let's put all that aside. We can debate that in the first drive review, and let's get back to the market launch of this vehicle. Notice we talked about an all-new Macan here. We didn't talk about an all-new internal combustion engine Macan. Now, you will not be surprised to learn it's going to be that Macan Electric and the existing gasoline car. Why? If I'm reading the tea leaves, back in the day when this car was being planned, Porsche thought, everybody's going electric, so says the EU and the US government. So we're going to plan only an electric car, and that's what they did. Now there's been some changes in the EU where there's some privacy concerns with the existing car, so says Porsche, where they can't update the existing car, do like a mid-cycle refresh to make it look more like the car we saw today, and thus make it more saleable for years to come. So what they're going to do is sell both side by side. They haven't given an end date to the gasoline car because the realities of this switch to EV have hit very hard. And it's not just what you've seen in the news in terms of EV sales are down, it's adoption of EVs with the mass market, basically crossing the chasm from the early adopters to the folks like you and I who are just looking for a car for point A to point B. So let's be very clear about this. Porsche is planning on bringing this totally new Macan built on a totally new platform that is EV only, has no gasoline counterpart to it. That is going to start this year and move forward. The gasoline counterpart that we've seen for many years, that's going to continue. There's no specific end date. Porsche's official line is as demand allows, because what we've seen in the market, people aren't really buying electrics as fast as governments and OEMs thought they would. That's, at least to my view, why Porsche's keeping the car around. Now, I asked them point blank, is there a provision that if demand still remains high for the internal combustion engine version of the Macan, would you do a full update? And the answer wasn't a flat out no, it was kind of like a blank stare, because if I'm reading the tea leaves correctly, there isn't a provision for it, and the investment would be very large. And that in turn brings us to the wish list. You're probably not going to be surprised what I'm going to ask for here. Let's make that potential provision for an update to the internal combustion engine version of the Macan more of a reality, because the realities of EV transition, meaning the timing that the governments around the world have mandated, that it's not happening. And most likely, the EU, which they already have pushed their mandates back, mainly because of Germany, and then Italy followed up, the US will most likely have to follow suit. So the reality is, this is the volume car for Porsche, one of the two volume cars. So it would be prudent to make sure there's an update to the internal combustion engine car. So yes, it can be sold in the EU moving forward, because that's where the stringent restrictions for privacy concerns, I believe, that's what Porsche stated, is a bigger issue for the gasoline car, which, for the avoidance of doubt, is no longer going to be sold in Europe. The gasoline car only continues in markets outside of Europe. I know this gets very confusing, but this is one of these very important transitions in going from internal combustion to EV, and I would argue this is kind of like a test case because it's such an important car, not just for Porsche, but where the market is going. Because if you think about it, there's a lot of promise for this car. The Taycan, performance-wise, great car and very important because it was the first real performance EV that was on offer, but that car now is 5 years old. The platform we saw today holds a lot of promise. Granted, we're going to put a pin in this part of the discussion until we actually drive the car and see the reality, experience the reality of it. But I'm going on too far. This is the point of the episode where I turn around to you guys to opine in the comments below, or via our social media, MotoManTV all word, MotoManTV all word, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. What do you think Porsche should be doing with the Macan? All electric, or should there be this contingency plan to update the gasoline car? Now, if you found this episode interesting, I would highly suggest you watch our episode with my personal car here. There's actually 3 of them. There was the premiere of the car from Galp and Porsche, where we talked about the build, and there was another episode, and this was probably far more interesting to me, where I got to drive the car with the guy who actually set the car up at the dealer. Fascinating behind the scenes look. You can see that episode here. Until I see you in the next episode, bis später.